Can you imagine being locked in a small cell around the clock, shackled with handcuffs and leg irons, given only an occasional shower, meals passed to you through slots and doors, and surrounded by your own feces and urine? I know this sounds like a horror movie, but it's not. This is life in a high security juvenile facility in Louisiana. It's a facility in St. Martinville where teens as young as 13 and 14 are sent to serve time for criminal activity. But some experts say this is child abuse. And I'm asking today, how can we treat our youth, teens, even juvenile offenders in this horrific way in 2022? Experts weigh in, coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
I read a story. It was in a couple of national newspapers and outlets about this 15-year-old boy who was literally in a cell approximately 23 hours a day, solitary confinement, they call it, in this juvenile facility in the state of Louisiana. And at a time when we're talking about criminal justice reform and reducing mass incarceration and figuring out better ways to treat people, even those people who commit crimes, I just was so shocked and appalled by the treatment of this teenager who was the person who was featured in this story about this facility in Louisiana, but teenagers across this country who are continuously subjected to these kinds of cruel and unusual punishments, sometimes for crimes that don't even involve violent acts, don't involve weapons, don't involve murder, don't involve physical injuries. We're trying to make sense of what the state is of juvenile justice in this country. I'm happy to be joined this morning by experts who have dedicated their lives to working on juvenile justice issues. My first guest is David Utter. He is the founder of the Fair Fight Initiative. He formerly was the director and co-founder of Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana. So he's right in Louisiana, has worked in the state, in the juvenile justice system. So happy to have you joining me this morning, David, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Reva. Good morning to you.
I'm sure you've read the story. It was in NBC. It was in a couple of other news outlets about this facility in St. Martinville and its treatment of teenagers. Can you help us understand what that facility is like? Because I don't think the article probably even tells all the horrors of the facility.
Well, I haven't been, but I can tell you from reading the article that it is like the other secure care facilities in Louisiana, and it's like the secure care facilities in Louisiana that I saw 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The way that Louisiana treats children accused and adjudicated delinquent has been pretty consistent. The article does a good job of talking about the attempt at reforms. But the through line is, number one, the failure of the reforms for these facilities. And number two, this is a story about race. When I sued Louisiana's juvenile prisons, 1998, 1999, the population in these places was overwhelmingly young Black men, up to 90%. Today, that stands the same. I read a OJJ report from Louisiana. 83% of the children who are locked up in Louisiana are Black. And as I said, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and I say it today, if these were white children, if these were wealthy white children, there would be a revolution about how we treat these kids. One last point, we know better, right? We know now after 50 years of research that locking a kid away from their home is the opposite of what they need. It's the opposite of effective treatment to ensure their success later on in life. And yet we continue to put children away like this. And then, the level of abuse that's happening, that's it's like next level. But We shouldn't be locking them away from their families in the first place.
Yeah, these stories are just so heartbreaking and frustrating at the same time, David. You no holds barred, just put it out there. The reality is this is a race issue. And if these were white kids, and they didn't even have to be super rich white kids, just white kids, period, we would see a totally different system of justice at play. But how in 2022, and that's the question that's so baffling for me, that we are still allowing Black kids to be treated in this fashion. Why isn't there more noise being made? I just found this article. It's not like it was all over the news or all over the media. I had to search for it. So help us understand why Black kids don't get a better shot when they maybe break the law, go astray, or whatever you want to call it. Why are we still penalizing Black kids in this way?
I think it's a couple things happening here, right? I mean, the entire criminal legal system in the United States is sort of foundationally about race, right? There are cities in the Deep South that their first police force was formed to chase slaves, runaway slaves. The whole system of mass incarceration or hyper incarceration, as Michelle Alexander notes in the new Jim Crow, is designed to penalize and debilitate Black families by taking Black men out of the equation, out of their homes, out of the community. And then there are the studies, and I think this is where it comes to play with kids. People view Black children, especially males, as older than they really are, right? And this is a sociological study, but we don't view and therefore give, especially Black, young men, the same opportunities, both opportunities of success, but then opportunities when they make mistakes. And this notion that, in spite of decades of research, that when a child does something wrong, when a child breaks the law, we're going to punish them by putting them away from their home for X amount of time, whether it be months or years. It's counterproductive, and in a case like this, it's devastatingly harmful to the children. I mean, I just can't imagine. I've got 3 kids, and if anybody did this to my child, my heart would absolutely break.
Yeah, you're talking about the adultification of Black kids, and we've seen it. We see it played out every day in the media. Black boys being thought of and treated like Black men, and the same stereotypes that we know that society has around Black men as being violent, as being menacing, as being basically subhuman. Those same attitudes get attached to Black boys. They're not treated as kids who have, time to grow and to develop and to mature and to make better choices. The story, though, this 15-year-old, that's the highlight of the story. No education being provided, no mental health services, no counseling, stuck in this cell for 23 hours. And they talk about when they let some of these kids out for that 1 hour that they get out, they're throwing their feces and urine at the guards as their only way of expressing their resistance. And the judge in this story, David, was like shocked to hear that this prison, let's call it what it is, prison facility for kids even existed. How can that be that the judge in this case was shocked to learn about the existence of this facility?
That's another through line, Areva. And I think it happens with prosecutors as well as a lot of times. 99.9% of these children are represented by public defenders, right? We all have a responsibility to know what's happening in these places. When a judge sends a child into the Office of Juvenile Justice's secure care system in Louisiana, that judge should be following up. That judge should visit facilities. The prosecutor, right? They're supposed to be about public safety. They need to know whether the children that they are advocating to be sent away are receiving the services that they are supposed to get. And I think it's particularly true with lawyers who represent these children. Sort of what happens to children post-adjudication is probably more important than what happens before they get into the system. And it's our obligation as members of the bar, as members of the bench, to follow up, to be visiting these facilities, to be talking to the children's counselors, their educators, whoever it is. I will make one other point. When we first sued Louisiana and eventually settled the lawsuit, Louisiana agreed to spend tens of millions of dollars every year in addition to what they were spending on education and medical and mental health care. But when the levels of violence and the levels of mistreatment, solitary confinement and shackling and handcuffing people are so high and so frequent, nobody can learn when they're traumatized. Nobody can learn, nobody can get better. Nobody can, sort of meditate or take effective counseling when they're constantly looking over their back from fear of being attacked by a guard or another person. So, safety is first. And this, what needs to happen here is an extensive review by independent experts and an extensive reform plan that depopulates these places as fast as possible and gets the children the treatment and the services they need in the community, because we know that's what works.
So I know you're saying, David, that the judge and everybody involved has an obligation to follow up and follow these kids to find out where they go and how they're being treated. But how common is that a judge, like in this story, wouldn't know that this whole facility, it wasn't that he didn't know perhaps where this kid was going. From reading the article, the judge didn't even know this facility existed. So how can that be? Is this facility some big secret in Louisiana? Or that's what I guess I was puzzled by.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that, Areva. The facility seems to be a response to what the department perceived as a crisis, and how they were able to open it up. Seemingly looks like under the dead of night, and then just start transferring young people there. That deserves a really hard look. But to the first point, it is really uncommon for judges to follow up on the care of the people that they're sending to these places. I can sort of number on one hand how many judges were receptive to arguments that, look, judge, we need to go visit this kid. When I talk to him or her, they're telling me these things. And one last point on that. I've interviewed, hundreds, if not thousands of kids in these facilities. And every time you see an official say, well, that child's lying, 99% of the kids that I spoke with, they're the ones telling the truth. So, these bureaucrats, these people in charge of this agency need to be held accountable. And, we need to start protecting these kids now.
But you said, David, that this facility, the St. Martinville facility, as horrible as it is described in this article, you're saying it's not so different than the other juvenile facilities. So you can go throughout the state of Louisiana and find facilities where there are kids shackled hands, feet, in solitary confinement for 23 hours without, mental health counseling, without medical care, without educational resources. Is that the standard of facilities in Louisiana for kids?
I have not been in the other 3 or 4 facilities in Louisiana in years, but I do know that there are recent media reports. I've talked to families with kids in these facilities. And if it's not the extremes of St. Martinville, right? If it's not solitary confinement, it's certainly, incredibly high levels of violence, staff that are ill-equipped and poorly trained to, really provide the counseling and services these young people need. And it's, again, the most important thing is these kids can be better served in the community if you wrap services around them, right? There are programs, nonprofits like, the Youth Advocate programs that have proven to be incredibly effective. They're much cheaper. And one can't help but think that the reason we're not switching to that in Louisiana is because of race and because of poverty. Again, if these were my kids, I think it'd be a very, very different sort of response to this stuff happening and to this systemic, problem that's been going on for decades.
And is this money too, race clearly at the center of this? But we hear about the industrial prison complex where private companies are making millions, if not billions, of dollars incarcerating people. But we typically think about that as adults. Are these juvenile facilities also huge money makers, either for private industry or for the state or counties throughout Louisiana?
There are certainly privatized components. I wouldn't be surprised if the food and maybe even the healthcare is privatized. These are state-run facilities. The problem is you develop this mindset that they're sort of job creators, especially the Swanson Correctional Center for Youth in Monroe, Louisiana. Really poor town, really poor part of the state. And, a job paying 27 grand a year with benefits is considered a good job. So we just have to get at this mindset of pulling the kid away from their communities, away from their home as a response to when they do something wrong.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, David, for helping us just get a better understanding in terms of what's happening in the state of Louisiana. That story is clearly, I think, a wake-up call, and hopefully will lead to the kind of reform that you talked about, getting these kids depopulated from these facilities, getting them back into their communities or community programs. I hope that folks are listening and watching in Louisiana, and that you have the will, because obviously the mechanism is there, the solutions are there. It's just a matter of the will to do the right thing by these kids who are, as you said, 83% of these kids are Black kids. Just breaks my heart.
Thank you so much for shining a light on it, Areva.
Yeah. All right. We're talking next to Mark Soler. He's an executive director of the Center for Children's Law and Policy, and Candice Jones. She is the president and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation, because we want to understand is what's happening in Louisiana, something that's happening across the country, and both of these are experts in juvenile justice. So good morning and welcome, Mark, and good morning and welcome, Candice. I'll start with you, Candice. David said this is all race, that this is Black kids being basically tossed away, thrown away, and it would be different if these were white kids. Is that your assessment as well?
There's no question about there's a racial component when you look at our justice system for youth and adults. Likewise, our ability to tolerate some of the inhumane conditions are completely tied to the fact that the majority of these youth are Black and brown. One of the things that you were talking about that I think is so important in these systems is also their general lack of transparency, how much it is that we don't know about what's happening and how that's both possible and tolerable. That is fundamentally tied to race, but a real issue here. And I think something that we really need to be concerned about generally for the case in, say, Martinville, but writ large for these systems across the country.
So, Mark, we know it. We the facts are there. The evidence is there. How do we tolerate this? It's so shocking.
And not only do we know it, but the Office of Juvenile Justice in Louisiana knows it. My colleagues and I worked with them and with people who are running the juvenile detention facilities in Louisiana a number of years ago to develop statewide standards, mandatory standards for detention facilities. Those standards are now in effect. They're part of the state regulations in Louisiana. Under those standards, what we've heard about Acadiana certainly would violate those standards. In addition, I was a member of a governor's appointed commission in Louisiana to develop standards for state commitment facilities, post-dispositional facilities like Acadiana. And we did develop a set of standards, and they are good standards. And the isolation and use of shackling and lack of education and lack of mental health services, those all violate those standards. I think the Office of Juvenile Justice got stuck here. They had too many kids. They needed to open up a place, and they tried to do it too quickly without enough preparation. I know the agency is concerned about staffing shortages. That's a real problem. We work in about 15 jurisdictions around the country. Staff shortages are a very real problem everywhere. They do not have enough staff. during the age of COVID. Staff don't want to go in and work in a closed environment where there's little air circulation and many people are unvaccinated. So that's a real serious issue. It's also a serious issue that staff have to feel safe in a facility. And it seems to me that the staff in Acadiana have not gotten the right kind of training. They don't know how to de-escalate situations. They are not taking care of that. And also the kids are bored.
But Mark, why are the kids there? Candice, David just said these kids should be in their communities. They should be, in their homes. So we can talk about staff shortages and training, but shouldn't we be talking about why are the kids there in the first place?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important for this system. One thing I want to clarify, because one of the things that we're doing, I actually think is a little bit dangerous, is we're legitimizing something that OJJ did in this instance, which is calling this place a facility that they opened, when really what they did in response to an incident is contract for beds in an adult jail. Yeah. There was no design process to say that we're serving youth here. That's what happened here. The reason no one knew about it is because they did not post it as a facility on their website like they do there. There was a fundamental breakdown and lack of transparency here. And those are issues. Like, this was not a facility. This is a reaction of where they just decided they were going to put some kids in this instance. And that's why people didn't know about it. And that's a problem. You're absolutely right. There are larger systemic issues that we need to be concerned about, which is not only should they not have been in this adult jail, but whether or not they should have been in the custody of OJJ, if what we're saying is that OJJ doesn't have the resources and capacity to better serve them. And I think that's exactly the kind of things that we should be talking about. Public welfare, we work in jurisdictions all over the country. And one of the things that we're really working on is saying, both on the youth and adult side, if we better resource communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, with the kind of supportive services that they need and deserve, we would be less reliant on these systems of incapacitation and incarceration, which we know only generate more harm. And we're seeing that in this instance in St. Martinville.
Yeah, and Mark, we know across the country there's an effort to reform the criminal justice system, including the juvenile justice system, and move away from these locked facilities. I live in Los Angeles County, and Los Angeles County is basically doing away with all of its juvenile camps, all of these lockdown facilities, because they don't work. And there's evidence and data that says they don't work. They're taking the juvenile system away from probation, which the probation department in LA County, those folks were trained to deal with adults, not juveniles. So they didn't even have the requisite training to deal with kids. But there was this big battle. And the battle was, which David just talked about, was jobs. This was going to mean probation would get reduced. The size of the LA County, which is one of the largest counties in the country, that probation department would lose jobs because now those probation officers wouldn't be involved with juveniles. And the fight wasn't about what's best for the kids. It was about keeping those good union jobs, those probation jobs. David said 27,000 in Louisiana. We're talking $90,000 plus in a city like Los Angeles County. So why aren't we talking more about what the reality is here? And that there are ways, like LA County is doing, to address this, horrific treatment of kids that we see, like in this place in St. Martinville.
Yes, and we know so much about what works with young people who are in trouble. We know that that most of the young people who are incarcerated could be perfectly well supervised in community-based programs. In fact, we can think about some of the youth who were at Acadiana and whether they needed to be there at all. For one thing, there are a lot of kids who are there because they're on 14-day COVID quarantines. And whether they need to be there for a full 14 days is a question, but they don't need to be in a jail if they are just in there for a quarantine. The boy who the article was about, I believe, was in trouble for stealing a car. One of the articles, one of the pieces described it as joyriding, which is taking a car and then giving it back, or if it was stolen. That's not a violent offense. If a young person commits that offense, of course they need to be held accountable, but they can certainly be held accountable with supervision in a program, in a service, in the community, and they don't need to be locked up. There are some young people who are charged with very serious crimes, and they need to be locked up to protect the community and usually to protect themselves too. That's a very small number of young people, and they should be in very small facilities that are very well staffed with very intensive treatment opportunities for them, as well as lots of other programming. When I read about Acadiana, I think, what are these kids doing during the day? My organization did a full-scale review of the juvenile justice system in the state of Maine, as David described, and we made lots of recommendations, and they have implemented those recommendations. Last summer, they had an outbreak of a number of violent incidents in the facility, and they asked us to go in and find out why. We talked to the kids, we talked to the staff, we looked at what was going on. Those kids were bored to tears. There was nothing for them to do. Anybody who has ever raised a teenager, anybody who's ever been a teenager knows you can't just sit around and do nothing. Teens need to be active. They need to have things going. So programming, meaning school and other kinds of programming, needs to be an important part of what goes on in these facilities. And that seems not to have happened in Acadiana.
So Candice, back to the LA model that I just described. I'm sure both of you are very familiar with it. Is that model being implemented in other places outside of Los Angeles County?
I love that you asked that question. You know, one of the things to hold up, Areva, is that LA both is working to be less reliant on probation and systems, but they are also at the same time really working hard to better invest in communities. Those two things have to happen in tandem. They created some time ago what's called GRID, the Gang Youth Reduction, this initiative where they were flooding resources to work with youth at highest risk of system involvement or being a victim or perpetrator of violence. And they were doing that really intentionally because there was an understanding there that where you place your bets systemically are how you're going to net outcomes. And systemically, we placed all our bets on these systems that are all about suppression and incarceration and not in communities and supportive services. So yes, it's happening in LA. It's happening in Oakland, where you see the Oakland Unite program, where they're trying to redirect resources as well. It's happening in New York, where they worked really hard to close a ton of youth prisons, drive resources with the youth back to the city of New York, and stand up programs like Arches. DC, the Credible Messenger Mentoring Movement, all those programs are very intentional efforts to say we need to shift resources. I ran the youth prison system in Illinois, and you raised a great point about jobs. There's no question about it. While I was there, we did significant reductions in the population. We cut the number of youth in custody in half. And when it came time to close a facility, it was unequivocal that that debate was about jobs and the impact on the community where the facility sat, not on families and the impact on the community where the kids were coming from. And we were making a case that those kids and resources needed to go back to their community. We spent, at the time I was there, $130 million on that system. When you think about how many resources you can unlock from these systems, if we use those same public dollars and drove those towards the communities that we came from, we can set up a continuum of care, supportive services, and better educational systems at the outset to serve these youth.
Okay, so Mark, Candice just laid it all out. Money, capitalism, supporting a system that provides jobs, provides an economic engine in a particular community where these juvenile justice or these juvenile facilities are. We know that they're not working. We know that they're not serving the kids. So who's opposing efforts to close these facilities? And not just, and Candice laid out, I don't know, maybe 5 cities, but we're talking about, you know, a country with thousands of these facilities, county by county, not just state by state. So who's the biggest opposition to this?
Well, the opposition is sometimes the agencies, but it is people who are in the communities who want those jobs available, but also it's often the people who work in those facilities. In many states, they're unionized, and those unions are very powerful, and they can dictate a lot in terms of policy, what's going on. But, you know, you talked about Los Angeles. The effort in Los Angeles is called reimagining juvenile justice. And that's what's really important. We want to get away from the old models of punitive confinement for young people and get to supportive models. We know what helps young people develop in a positive way. We know what are developmentally appropriate programs for young people. That's what we need to have in our programs. And most of those are available in communities. And there are certainly lots of places beyond what Candice was talking about, lots of jurisdictions around the country at the county level and at the state level really are trying to do these things. It takes time. But what we've seen in Acadiana is far beyond accepted practice in juvenile facilities around the country. It's unprofessional and should not happen.
Yeah, Mark, yeah, things do take time, but hasn't there been enough time? I mean, this isn't like new. The work that you're doing, the evidence, the science, the data, it's not new. I mean, maybe new is 20 years, 30 years. So how much time are we to give? And Candice, I do want to ask you, Mark talked about the unions, obviously very powerful, very strong. But what are the other forces at play? Because David said it was race. So that's a whole different area than these unions. So what you ran one of these facilities, you were trying to close or at least decrease the kids in the facility. What else were you running up against?
It's unions, it's the fact that they're jobs, it's policymakers as well that represent these communities and their resources from the local level up to their state representatives and all those people in their conference, if it's a conservative conference or even a Democratic conference that are working with them, they can be oppositional forces if they think it's going to take resources for their communities. There's also something that we haven't talked about, and that's that we are also working against a norm. We have normed that the way to respond to youth, to respond to our states, our communities, our country's children is by these systems. We've normed that. And it takes a sort of significant re-education to be able to move from that. And I agree with Mark that there are other examples in places that we can point to of programs and services in community, but we have not bet on them at scale. Those types of programs and services, we give cents on a dollar compared to what we put into systems that are about law enforcement and suppression. I mean, literally, whenever there's a budget crisis, the first thing that we're sweeping to get more general revenue is programs and services, the very things that sort of tear at the fabric of communities. We're not investing them in a big enough way to allow the innovation in space to really strengthen those continuums. We can point to bright spots, but we actually really need to start advocating for sustained and high-level investment.
Mark, totally agree with you, Candice, on that. And you're right, those community programs are the first to go. And when there's a spike in crime, and as we're seeing right now in this country, the default position is more police, more incarceration, lock more people up, give harsher sentences. We fall back on that whenever we see changes in our crime rates. So, Mark, how much of this criminal justice reform work that's being talked about at the national level, at the federal level, has juvenile justice as a part of it? Because I don't really hear a lot about reforming the juvenile justice system as we are talking about mass incarceration and addressing penalties that are given to adults, reducing those penalties. We see a lot of progressive prosecutors, and let's talk about those for a minute. In Los Angeles, Gascon, the LA County prosecutor, who said he was not going to charge crimes of children as adults or juveniles as adults. Tremendous pushback on that. So is the juvenile justice system really a part of this larger effort to reform the larger justice system?
The truth is that there are many efforts around the country at the prosecutor level. There are about 25 very progressive prosecutors around the country in major cities that are doing similar kinds of things. I've worked with the district attorney's office in Philadelphia that has done tremendous work. They're not going to involve kids in the juvenile justice system for low-level offenses. They just set rules. They're not going to prosecute. That's been true in Baltimore and in Boston and other cities around the country. All of that is critically important. Aretha, one of the things that is driving this is fear of Black children, especially fear of young Black males. In the article about Acadiana, it was clear that the staff people are afraid of the children there. They are afraid to go in. Young Black males have been so demonized in our country. There's a wonderful new book out by my friend Chris Henning called The Rage of Innocence, How America Has Criminalized Black Youth, that really talks about it and and really lays out the whole thing there. But this is about fear of young Black children. I was in the lockdown unit in South Carolina a couple of months ago. We're working with them. I went into the lockdown unit where kids were there 23 hours a day. They were locked up. They were behind bars. And I wanted to talk to all the kids who were in the lockdown unit. And the staff looked at me and they said, well, we can't guarantee your safety if you go into their cell. I said, I've been doing this work for more than 40 years. I've never had a young person threaten me. Young people who are incarcerated are looking for adults who will listen to them, who will take their concerns seriously, and who will be genuinely concerned about their development. We want these kids to go back to their communities as productive members of their communities. That means they need education, mental health care, and other kinds of supports.
All right, Candice, this is the $1 million question. Everybody keeps talking about it. We keep coming back to this issue of race, fear of Black kids. David talked about it. Mark's talked about it. Mark is saying he's seen it play out in real time with staff that have this irrational fear of Black kids, like Black kids are any worse than any other kids. How do we address that? I mean, that is so entrenched. The images, the way Black boys and men are portrayed in the media. We have this conversation a lot on the show. People who have experienced it, stand next to a white woman and she clutches her purse. I've told stories of my husband who's afraid to be in a gymnasium, a workout facility with white women by himself because of that fear that if something happens, it's going to be his fault. She's going to be believed over him. How do we address this as it relates to our kids and these horrific conditions that they are in these facilities?
It's the fundamental question. And I have two responses. One is through the narrative work, right? Doing what you're doing, which is making sure these conversations stay at the fore. And we have to deal with and really honestly sort of struggle with our history and its impact on our policies today. The second, and I'm just not going to hesitate, we also got to put some scratch in communities of color, because we can't just talk about these things. We have to empower community, these youth, to have the jobs and resources so they can evidence for the world their ability to contribute to society in a way that we haven't done in the past. People forget that policing, prisons, these were all systems mostly funded by public dollars that we scaled in the 80s and 90s. We funded that. We can make the choice with public dollars to start to scale investments in communities, supportive services, jobs, and opportunity that will allow communities to thrive. And we need to make sure we're doing that narrative work and framing work, but that we're also concretely putting our money where our mouth is.
So, Mark, as a white man that's done this work and have worked with kids of all races, have seen the injustices, the discrimination, the racism, Bill Barr, our former attorney general, just said that he doesn't believe that there is systemic racism in policing. And he said that with a straight face. That's echoed, we know, by these Republican legislatures around the country that are trying to prevent the teaching of Black history, trying to sanitize the U.S. history around slavery. How do we ever get to a system where we're going to decriminalize some of these low-level offenses, create a more equitable justice system if the powers that be, and many of these are white men, say that we don't even have an issue, we don't have a problem, race isn't a problem?
My organization does a lot of work working with local jurisdictions to reduce racial disparities in the juvenile justice system. The amount of denial that we see is monumental. People will do almost anything to avoid discussing these issues. They'll talk about, we need to solve poverty, and until we solve poverty, we can't deal with race. And they'll say, no, we need to put that off. Or they'll say, you're making things worse by talking about that. That is not true. This is pervasive in the system, and we need to work at the individual level, also at the system level. At the individual level, we need to make sure these systems address individual young people. The best justice system is a system that would be fair to anybody, that you and I would be happy for our children, our grandchildren, our nieces and nephews to go into. We don't have that kind of system now. So the systems need to talk to the individual kids and see what their needs are. At the system level, we need to reduce incarceration dramatically. There's a new report that came out a few days ago from the Sentencing Project called Too Many Locked Doors. There are 250,000 young people locked up in this country every year. One-day counts show about 60,000 kids on one day, but over the course of a year, it's almost 250,000 young people. In many places, they are subjected to these kinds of conditions. We need to stop locking up so many young people for unnecessary and inappropriate reasons. For young people who were truly dangerous, of course, we need to make sure that they're separated from the community, but that should be in very small, secure facilities that are well-staffed.
All right, Candice, we got to end this conversation. Give us some hope.
We can hope by looking at the communities that are innovating. The work that's going on in Oakland around wrapping youth in their community and providing living wage jobs for the people that are working. Think about it, Areva. If we had a world where the money we're spending on these systems and staffing, we were employing social service agencies, people to deliver cognitive behavioral therapies, giving those kinds of certifications and living wage jobs to people in these communities to work within their own community, it would be a game change. That's the hope, because even without the kind of resources they deserve, you see communities innovating all day. You see it in Oakland, you see it in Ready in Chicago, you see it with the credible messenger movement in DC. So there is a lot of hope. We just need to make sure that we are just rabidly advocating that there's actually some scratch to continue to grow it.
Yeah, one thing you just said, just kind of a light bulb went off for me. It's like the probation officers and these other prison guards and people in these facilities that are so afraid of losing their jobs. There are other jobs for them. We're not trying to make them unemployed. We want them to work and to be able to take care of their families. They just need to work in different capacities.
Absolutely.
So you just got to convince them that, you're not going to be policing kids in facilities. You're going to be helping kids in the community. So there's a way that it's not a binary choice. Put people out of work and devastate communities or help kids. We can do both at the same time.
Areva, you know as well as I do, there was a moment in history in this country where we justified the institution of slavery because it was an economic engine.
Yeah. All right, you're supposed to be giving me hope, Candice.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I gave you a very direct assignment, and now you've undermined my hope. I was feeling good. I want to thank you and Mark. What a great conversation. Thank you for your insights. Thank both of you for the advocacy and the work that you're doing. So important, so needed. Mark, helping us understand what's happening in that Louisiana facility is so important. I hope the folks in Louisiana are humiliated enough, shamed enough, or, outraged enough, or whatever emotion it's going to take for them to take some action. I hope they are moved to act to help those kids that are in that facility get out of that facility and unlock our kids across that state and across this country. But thanks so much again for both of you for your expertise. Now I want to talk to Kristie Puckett Williams. She is such an amazing person. She's statewide campaign director for Smart Justice. She works with the ACLU in North Carolina. She's been incarcerated. She's a fierce advocate for those who are coming out of the criminal justice system. Welcome back, Kristie. You've been listening to this conversation. Tell us what the families must be going through who have kids in the kind of facilities that we've just talked about in Louisiana.
Well, number one, thank you so much for having me back, Areva. And as someone who spent time inside of carceral facilities as an adult, I just can't imagine what it's like to be a child. I was a young person, a young adult, 21, the first time I was ever arrested, and, was back and forth in the carceral state. I'm still currently involved in the carceral state, even as a 42-year-old woman. And what I know is that my long history in this subservient, subjugated state as an impacted person, I can't imagine what that would be like to be a child experiencing that. And I can't even imagine as a parent myself what it would feel like to have a child that is involved in such a torturous, inhumane, degrading, diminishing, disconnecting, disappearing system. And I heard Candice talk about the lack of transparency. That's true in adult facilities, but it is even more true inside of juvenile facilities, because what they say is that the secrecy is to protect that juvenile, when all it really does is protect the officials from accountability around the treatment, the inhumane and, again, often torturous treatment that our children are being subjected to for very minor offenses. That, again, when we think about juveniles, I think what we don't oftentimes remember is that youth are often caught up in a system for something that as an adult they would never be arrested for, right? And so skipping school, or, truancy, not being at them, hanging out at the mall, loitering, vagrancy. Yeah, those aren't things that an adult would be arrested for. But there are so many young people that are caught up in a system for simply hanging out and doing what we know started, to Candice's point, in the Black codes in the 1680s, where vagrancy and loitering were ways for white people who were deputized by the state, by the system, to figure out the status of Black people who were in their community, whether they were enslaved or free. White folks were required to investigate what the status of a person was. And we see that happening over and over again in our communities through our youth, but also through the phenomenon known as Karens, asking people, well, do you live here? Or is this a pool that you're supposed to be in? And so what we've seen historically, we still see that happening today. And the people who experience that the most are our children.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that point about transparency, because you're right. So much of what happens to juveniles is shrouded in secrecy under the guise of protecting the child's identity and, protecting them in some way. And what it does do is it prevents the public from looking in, because I can't even imagine why there hasn't been lawsuits filed against this facility for having 23-hour lockdowns, having kids in solitary confinement like that.
Well, because that's common. You would have to sue every single facility in the country if you were going to sue, because solitary confinement, whether they call it segregated housing unit, whether they call it the administrative detention unit or the disciplinary detention unit or the segregated housing, they call it all types of different things. And so another way they shroud in secrecy and avoid transparency is by changing the language. But no matter what happens, no matter what you call it, there are people, over 2 million people, going to bed inside of cages tonight, and the majority under the guise of COVID and, being protective. Now we have justified the 23.5-hour day lockdown. We even allowed that for pregnant people. As you know, in North Carolina, we worked on legislation that would that banned the shackling of pregnant folks, but also essentially through that banning, we were able to ensure that pregnant folks had regular access to their day-to-day movement, because under the Safekeeper program, what they say is to keep them safe, they place them in solitary confinement as a safety measure. And so what does that look like? 23.5 hours a day locked down, a shower twice a week, not communicating with your family, not having regular access to your mail, solitary is punitive. It's a punishment. It is not, it doesn't feel very safe, because what you feel like is, if something happens to me, no one will know, no one will care, and I could die in this cell and no one would come to help me.
It just hurt my heart, Kristie, to hear Mark say that when he went, I guess it was to that South Carolina facility, he wanted to talk to those kids in these solitary confinement situations, that the guards basically said, we can't guarantee your safety. These are some Black kids, they're dangerous. Did you experience that level of overt racism inside these facilities?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I mean, first of all, the reason that we even have facilities is based off of racism, right? And so racism is baked into the fabric of a carceral facility. And so racism is going to exist inside of those facilities. It is not covert, it is overt, it is not implicit, it is explicit. And so, when you look at a courtroom on any given day, when you look up at any city, regardless of the racial makeup of that city, and then you go into the courtrooms, whether that's an adult or a juvenile courtroom, you will see nothing but Black and brown youth, which is not reflective of the population of that city. And so what we know is that police are targeting Black and brown youth, and that targeting results in this over incarceration of Black and brown children. in cages. Now, what we don't talk about even enough of is the amount of immigrant children who are in detention centers, who are being treated even worse because they don't have any rights, because they are not considered citizens of this country, that whatever rights that we would afford to our juveniles, they don't even get that. We have seen babies who don't even understand inside of immigration proceedings, that don't have their parents with them, that don't have guardians, that whose attorney can't even communicate with them, but yet they are involved in proceedings, judicial proceedings, as babies under 2 years old. And so the way we treat our children in this country is very, very harmful. And we never estimate the violence that the system directs towards the people, but we're always investigating the violence that the people have towards one another without ever really saying, like, hey, this systemic violence is what maintains, sustains, and perpetuates the violence that people have between each other. And I just want to get away from, like, we need to reform this system. We need to abolish and get rid of this system. There is no reason that anyone, for any reason, should go to bed in a cage at night. With the amount of resources that we spend on policing, on military, on colonizing the world, and imperialism around the world, we have the resources here to ensure that people who are involved in harmful behaviors have resources to help mitigate that harm. But we are over-invested in capitalism and ensuring that people go to bed in a cage so that that prison industrial complex continues to be well-resourced.
Yeah, and I don't feel like we talk nearly enough. Obviously, the mass incarceration, the criminal, the industrial prison industry around adults, we got to stay focused on that. But we are not talking nearly enough about kids in the juvenile justice system, and the fact that there are kids. For a lot of people, they can't even imagine that kids are in solitary confinement, in shackles, barely getting fed, not getting any education, not getting any resources, barely getting out. Literally, that article talked about them being surrounded by their own feces and urine in that little cell that they're in. We just don't talk enough about that. And it's so clear that most of those kids, as Candice and Mark and David said, shouldn't even be in a facility, should be in a community, should be at their home, should be in some program. It boggles my mind. And it's so offensive that we know that these are Black kids. And Mark said it as a white man, and David said it as a white man. If these were white kids, we would have fixed it. It wouldn't even be this. We would have started it. Let's start there. We would have never started it. We would have never let it get to this point. How do we get through to the people? I'm just so frustrated. I don't even know.
Yeah. Well, it's all of this treatment is allowable because Black and brown children are seen as less than human, right? And so the dehumanization and the mistreatment, it stems from not being seen as equal, because that is the difference. I mean, if you're saying that if this were white children, this would never happen, then what is the difference between white children and Black children? The color of their skin. We have devalued Black and brown skin such that it is okay when Black and brown skin is enslaved, when Black and brown people are tortured, when Black and brown people are segregated, disappeared, again, disconnected from their human rights. That is okay because they are not human. They are
Let me ask you this. I got to end on this. Okay. I got to get some positive because I'm just too.
Okay. I can help you be positive
right now. Are you seeing any changes? You've been at this a while.
Definitely.
Definitely. Okay, so tell us the positive things that you see changing. So Candice talked about some of these programs that are following the LA County model, or they're similar to LA County. What are you seeing in your city and state?
We're seeing an awareness. We are seeing that the conversation is happening. Before, I felt, 5 years ago, I felt like I was the town crier, like this is happening, and no one's listening. And now people are actually listening. And so we have to remain hopeful. Hope is a practice. The only way that we as Black people have been as resilient, have been able to overcome and go through and go by is through our ability to remain hopeful and faithful. And so we're going to have to stand on the hope and the faith and the things unseen, that justice is real, that liberty is attainable, that freedom will reign. That is what I tell myself every day, and that my children and my grandchildren will not spend time in a cage, and anybody's children who does will have the best experience of that cage that they have. I don't want children to spend any time in a cage, but if they do, we have to make sure that the conditions of incarceration are such that we're getting what we want. If we want their behavior to be changed, we cannot do things that make sure that their behavior not only does it stay the same, but gets worse, because that's what we're doing right now.
So great to hear that, you now have been validated. You're not crazy. You're not making this up. This is real.
I'm not. This is real.
And that's a good feeling because sometimes
It is.
you're speaking out and you're the only person speaking out. And I've been in that position before. You start to doubt yourself, like, is this really a problem? Because nobody else sees it. So thank you for continuing and persevering, even when people were not validating what you were speaking out about. Beyond though listening to you, which is important. I don't want to minimize that, but are you seeing any other positive steps?
Yes.
Like changing the policy.
Yes.
Progressive prosecutors in your state not criminalizing these low-level offenses and not putting kids in the system in the first place.
Yes. So I have been having lots of really good conversations and having, working on really progressive policies, not as progressive as I would like to see them. Now, let me just say that. I want to see no jails, no prisons, nobody in cages. But we are making incremental steps to get to that vision where the community is well-resourced and well-equipped to handle the social, political, and economic issues that we are now addressing through incarceration. Because, again, the kids that are going into those cages have social, economic, and political issues that are being addressed through incarceration. And so I am hopeful in Mecklenburg County, which is one of the largest, most resource counties in North Carolina where I live. They are working intentionally to not lock kids up, to make sure that kids have resources. Is it perfect? And it is definitely not. However, the conversation is happening and we are constantly interrogating and disrupting and agitating. Something that was flowing so smoothly before now is not flowing as smoothly. And I am hopeful, I'm very hopeful that in the next 5 years, we will really see our children being not just in our communities, but productive, active, civically engaged, politically engaged, socially engaged, productive members of our community. Because what I think about is the amount of talent and the amount of neuroscientists and biomolecular physicians and physics majors that aren't doing and practicing any of that because they are languishing inside of a cage, stuck inside of a cage 23 and a half hours a day.
Kristie, if you could imagine a world where racism didn't exist, what would it look like for these kids? These 83%, that number of the system, 83% of them are Black kids. If racism didn't exist, what would the world look like for those kids?
We would have peace. We would have peace. Not saying that harm would not exist, but we would have a positive peace. Because right now, the peace that we have is a negative peace. It's not just the absence of violence. It's like the harm is still existing. And I think that it would look like communities that are, again, well-resourced, that are thriving, that are connected to one another. You know what's happening with your neighbor. And if your neighbor needs something, you have something for that neighbor. You don't have to agree with them politically. It is a person in need who needs something and you have that need and you can supply that need. It really looks like connectivity. It really looks like deep, intentional relationship building and resourcing, again, the people, not the systems that try to keep the people separated and divided. It doesn't look like division. It looks like unity, to be quite honest.
I love that. It looks like peace. It looks like unity. You got to end it there. Thank you so much, Kristie, for the work you're doing. Thank you for helping me find some hope in this very, very, very disheartening, heartbreaking conversation. That article just broke my heart. I was so just outraged by it. And
well, I want you to continue to use your voice and continue to highlight the youth, but also the amount of people with intellectual and developmental mental health and substance use disorders that are also young people that are being targeted by the system as well. And you do that better than anyone I know. So keep up the fine work.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that is a whole population that also is missing in this conversation that should not be missing, because they are also, when you look at juveniles, when you look at so many of those kids, they had learning disabilities, they had developmental disabilities, they were never diagnosed, never tested, never given the educational resources, and then they end up in juvenile justice, and we wonder why. And we can look back. I have a good friend, she actually serves on a board with me. She's a public defender, and she her group got a grant, and for like 5 years, she did nothing but go to schools and attend IEPs with parents and help parents advocate for services. And they were able to keep so many kids out of the system because they were getting them the educational help that they needed, because these were kids who were 15 and couldn't read.
Right.
Pushed through school or pushed out of school, but they had fundamental learning disabilities. And when they got tutoring and educational support and learned to read, they could make different choices, because some bully couldn't tell them to go in the store and grab something out the store, because now they had the ability to discern and make better decisions, because
that's right.
Participate in society. Because if you can't read, you don't even know what's going on around you. So
That's
Yes,
right.
that's another population for another day. But thank you so much, Kristie, for your
Thank you.
advocacy, and always a pleasure to see you, my friend. Wow, I want to thank all of my guests this morning, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Such a heartbreaking conversation on one hand, but such a needed conversation on the other hand. And there are experts and advocates out there like my guest this morning who are making a difference and who are standing up against the racism and standing up against the institutionalization of Black and brown kids in these facilities. As Candice said, we shouldn't even call them facility. They're adult prisons and jails where our kids are being housed, they're being warehoused, they're being denied basic services, they're being denied their basic rights. And we've got to stand up against that. We got to speak out against that. And whenever we see those injustices, we all have an obligation, because we can't say our kids are our future and expect them to lead us if we're not providing them with the resources, the love, and the nurturing they need now. And just because a kid makes a mistake at 14 or 15 doesn't mean that kid should be doomed for the rest of his or her life. And they should not be traumatized in a cell where they're shackled and where they're defecating in that cell and having to sit in that, that environment. And that should not be the way we treat kids who make mistakes. And we know better. And those are my words of wisdom. Maya Angelou has told us so many times. She told us with that great quote that when we know better, we do better. And we do know better in this country. And we must do better by our kids. All right, y'all, I'm out. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.